Coming up, fault lines in the global economic system.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs.
Our speaker explores the rupture between finance and morality and puts forth ideas to align financial incentives with moral imperatives. Now presenting Raghuram Rajan.
This book, Fault Lines, which I'm going to talk about, is basically taking the standard explanations for the crisis and asking, are these sufficient? What are the standard explanations? Well, to caricature them, we have greedy, conflicted bankers. As one banker put to me, when you talk about conflicts of interest, when there's no conflict, there's no interest. That's the banker's view. And client regulators. So these two were at the center of the crisis. It was because of them. And what we need to do is fix the bankers, make them less greedy, change incentive systems, etc., and fix the regulators, give them a lot more regulations to implement, forgetting that they didn't implement the old regulations in the first place. But then we fix the system and we're done. We can go ahead and do everything we did before. And I think this is extremely simplistic and worrisome, because what if the problem is deeper? My argument is, yes, there are these what I call serious fault lines in the US and the world economy, and the financial sector was at the center of those fault lines. Now, this is not to absolve the bankers. This is not a defense of what the bankers did. They were neither innocent nor victims, but they did respond to implicit and explicit incentives that the system created, and therefore we must make sure that those incentives aren't created again, else we will suffer. Also, I think an equally simplistic view of the regulators is, they were driven by laissez-faire ideology. This was the market works. Yes, there was some of that. But also, I think they had a deeper and in many ways appropriate agenda, which interfered with the way they regulated the system, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And in a sense, we had the perfect storm, with everybody following what were in many ways reasonable courses of action when taken alone, but when taken together were calamitous. And that's why I think it's important to think about what happened and think about what we can do about it in a more constructive way. So the first fault line I want to talk about, the underlying fissure in the world economy, is growing inequality. Not just in the United States, though I emphasize the United States in the book, but elsewhere also. The first chart shows you the 90-50 hourly wage differential. What does that mean? Take somebody at the 90th percentile of the wage distribution in the United States, compare their wage with the 50th percentile wage, and plot that over time, and you see the 90th percentile wage earner, who's typically a manager in a store, is walking away quite fast from the person at the 50th percentile, who's usually an assistant, an office assistant, or a factory worker. This, to my mind, is a profound source of concern. And, most middle-class columnists focus on the inequality above them. They look at John Paulson, the hedge fund manager, made $3.75 billion in 2008, which is 75,000 times the average household income. That's enormous wealth. But that's, to my mind, less worrisome than really this 90-50, because this is what most Americans see is a source of concern, is a source of public policy responses which become problematic. Now, what's driving this? Why the 90-50 inequality? And I think the best answer is given by two professors at Harvard University, Larry Katz and Claudia Golden. And they basically argue it's not technology. Most people say technology is running away from us, and that's why we need more and more skilled, educated people. In truth, technology has been on a gallop throughout the century. I mean, we talk about Facebook and internet and so on, At the beginning of the 20th century, it was chemical plants, large integrated chemical plants which hadn't been seen before. They were as much of a leap for people moving from the farms as the Facebook and internet and so on are for people moving with a high school degree into the cities. So technology has been on a gallop throughout recent history. What has happened is the supply of highly educated people has fallen behind. To give you a couple of examples, high school graduation rates in the U.S. have been stagnant since the 1970s. And you can get a little more action if you add in graduate equivalency diplomas, but those aren't really worth the paper they're written on. So in truth, America is falling behind as far as high school graduation goes. But we don't just need a high school graduate nowadays. The 90-50 differential reflects a college to high school differential. We need people with college education, and that's extremely worrisome because you look at the graduation rates for males for cohorts born in the 1970s are no different from the graduation rates for males born in the 1940s for cohorts. So we haven't increased the number of male graduates. Female graduates has moved up, and that's sort of positive, but for male graduates there's been no difference. Now, this is a massive problem. And it's a problem which, really the roots are complex, but lie in some combination of families breaking up, communities becoming more dysfunctional, inadequate preschool preparation, and an inadequate K-12 experience. And my argument in the book is inequality is often, if you look at every emerging market, bad policy emerges from inequality. Why? Because, take what happened with the subprime crisis, right? As more Americans were left behind, if in perception, if not in reality, you had increasing polarization. It's well known that Congress has become more polarized over time, and there are studies of this. But it also makes these issues of inequality harder to tackle. There is no political support for redistribution, and of course it entails massive incentive costs and so on. The one thing that the Village Voice suggests the Clinton administration, the Bush administration agreed on was home ownership, and they pushed it massively with massive infusions of money. But there were other instruments that were used. Interestingly, many of these instruments were created to deal with the mess in the Depression and gave the government the entryway into housing. The Community Reinvestment Act was applied and enforced for the first time in the 90s. It's of course the 70s Act which wasn't enforced. The Federal Housing Administration reduced its lending standards, sent more money. A wall of money went towards low-income housing. I say this is important because it's hard to imagine that the private sector suddenly woke up one day and had a social conscience and said, we have to finance low-income housing. Why it did that, why so much money went that way, was because this was fundamentally good intentions on the part of the government. We want more home ownership, but done in a way which actually created massive distortions in the financial sector. So the fault line here is rising inequality and the political pressure to do something. Typically across countries, it existed in Spain also, for example, but I want to highlight the presence in the U.S. Second fault line I want to focus on is an international fault line. Post-war, Germany and Japan were flat on their backs. Capital stock largely destroyed, people very poor as a result of the war. How did they grow? They basically latched on to an export-led growth strategy because there's no domestic demand. They had to depend on demand outside. And their banks and governments basically focused on creating strong producers who could service the foreign demand, create domestic jobs, and help these countries grow out of poverty, the poverty created by the war. This was an extremely successful strategy. There is no period in history other than through conquest where a country has grown faster than Japan grew between 1950 and 1973. Per capita growth rates of 8% a year. Never before in history has that been seen. In many ways, it set the example for the East Asian economies, for economies like Korea, Taiwan, eventually Chile, and now China. Okay. Now, what is central to the strategy is you help the producers, typically by discriminating against your households. And you keep the producers honest by forcing them to export, because then they are forced to compete in the world economy, and that keeps them relatively efficient. And it worked. Many of these countries, this is in many ways for a development economist, when you look at this, this is probably the only strategy which has worked in terms of pulling countries out of poverty quickly. However, there's a deep flaw in the strategy. And the deep flaw in the strategy is, while you can get your export sector to be very disciplined, very competitive, the strong intervention that is entailed in this kind of growth strategy means that many domestic-oriented producers tend to use the government to make their industries uncompetitive. Okay? So these countries have very strong export sectors, very weak domestic-oriented producing sectors. The New York Times ran a story on haircuts in Japan recently. You know, haircuts in Japan are very expensive. This upstart chain decided, well, we'll challenge the existing sort of guilds and try and give cheap haircuts. So it set up shop and started expanding very fast, lots of custom for cheap haircuts. And the barber guild got very worried and tried to figure out how to stop this. Well, eventually, what it did was it said, giving a haircut without having a shampoo first is unhygienic. Therefore, you must first have a shampoo and then offer a haircut. Well, this was an ingenious way to drive the franchise out of business, because you needed, you know, expensive hair washing facilities to give a shampoo. And so immediately discriminated against them, and their cost structure went up, and their growth slowed tremendously. But this is an example of the broader point that when you don't have competition and you can use the powers, regulatory powers of the government, you can constrain growth. And Japan has very constrained growth, which means it's dependent on the world economy to pull it out of slumps, because internally it can't do it. I mean, the last so many years, 20 years of trying to get out, Japan has had massive stimulus plan after massive stimulus plan. The entire Japan is now covered with concrete from the kinds of construction plans that were put together, but it's still not come out because it depends on external growth. But the broader point is, we have a bunch of exporters in the world who don't have strong sources of domestic demand, who are pumping goods into the world economy. Those goods are looking for buyers. And that creates a deep problem, because it wants countries to overspend to buy those goods. Now, if I tell you that in the 90s, the countries that overspent were the emerging markets, in the 2000s, the countries that were overspent sounds like a rogues gallery of countries that are now in trouble. The US, the UK, Greece, Portugal, Spain, to some extent Italy, but not that much. But, I mean, who are the countries in trouble now? Many of the countries that spent beyond their means. The third fault line I want to point to, again a specific U.S. fault line, is the nature of U.S. recessions has changed. U.S. recessions used to be in and out. You went in, you came out. Why? Because firms cut jobs in the auto industry, for example. As soon as demand started coming back, they went quickly to rehire. And so typically it took 2 quarters for growth to come back, 8 months to recover all the lost jobs, not just for job growth to be positive, but to recover all the lost jobs from the depth of a recession. And that's why the thin U.S. safety net, you get unemployment benefits for 6 months, seemed to work reasonably well. You had enough while you were looking for a job, and typically the jobs came back. Something changed starting 1991. In 1991, it took 3 quarters for growth to come back to the levels it was before, but it took 23 months for jobs. In 2001, it took 1 quarter for growth to come back, but it took 38 months, 3.25 years, for jobs to come back. What do we know about the current recession? The question we have to ask is the safety net adequate for the kinds of recovery we've seen? Why do I say this is important? Because policy is often driven by politics, and politics is driven by public anxiety. And public anxiety is driven by the fears of unemployment, not just from those who are actually unemployed, but those who prospectively could get unemployed. And what we've seen again and again as far as government policy goes policy driven by a crisis is not good policy, and we've seen that in the stimulus post 2001. We saw that in the recent stimulus. But more than the fiscal stimulus, I want to point to is the monetary stimulus, which to my mind is even more problematic. People say Greenspan was asleep on the job. Why didn't he raise interest rates? Why didn't Greenspan, take a more active role in regulation? I want to argue that no central banker would be brave ernoughh to raise interest rates when unemployment is where it is. If jobs aren't coming back, nobody's going to raise rates. That was true of Greenspan. It is true of Bernanke right now. In fact, Greenspan went further and said, look, you guys are worried about investing. I'm assuring you, if there's a double dip, I will come in and pour more money into the economy. This was the famous Greenspan put, which is saying, I will flood the economy with liquidity if, in fact, you have a problem. So these kinds of government policies are a response to the political inadequacies of the safety net to some extent, but they create tremendous incentive distortions in the financial sector. So as you often say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, these kinds of fault lines, in some sense, create the underlying incentive structures for the financial sector to go merry. I want to argue that the nature of the arm's length financial sector is such that it makes you focus on whether you're making money or not, and that in many ways is a good thing, except when the prices get distorted. Quick example, and then the point. I mean, most people care about whether their work has value, right? And I think the financial sector is no exception. So when we say greedy bankers, why did they suddenly become greedy and without social conscience? And I want to give you my explanation for that in a second. But the experiment I want to talk about is an experiment which was run by MIT researchers using Harvard students. They wanted to set the Harvard students a task that they thought was adequate to their mental capabilities, which they didn't think highly of. So they asked them to make models out of Lego Bionicle kits, right? It's a model kit. You put together the Bionicle. And the experiment was to try and see whether you feel like working more when you have a product, when you can see the value of your work. So what they had was they had these guys come in, sit down, and put together the models, and they paid you on a decreasing scale for every additional model that you built, right? So at some point you were going to quit. It wasn't worth even the time you were spending to make a model for 5 cents. But they altered the experiment for one group of subjects by doing the following. One group of subjects made the model. The assistant came, and as you were making the second model, she dismantled the first model and gave you back the kit. So it was as if, you were on a wheel going nowhere. For the second group, she took the model and put it on a shelf. And so you could see 8, 9, 10 models as you built them. Well, I mean, most people would know that even when you put them on a shelf, once they left the room, they'd be dismantled. They didn't think those models were being kept for posterity. But just the fact that in one case they dismantled it right off, while in the other case they were kept for a while, made a difference in how long you wanted to go doing this, right? The point is that we care about the effects of our work, right? We want to see these things, and the more we see it, the more we want to build good things. The problem with the financial sector to some extent is it's become an arm's length transaction-oriented financial sector. In many ways, this is a good thing. It allows risk to be spread. It allows us to do things that enhance value provided the market prices are right. For example, a short seller who's selling Enron because he thinks the accounting is flawed, right? And makes a ton of money doing that, is providing service to society because he's putting Enron out of business. And Enron wasted tremendous amounts of resources in this society which could have been better utilized elsewhere. But if he looked at Enron and saw the people going to work every day, saw the people who'd lose their jobs, he would be a little less motivated to sell the shares short, worry a little. Compassion would be a bad thing in this case. The fact that he's at an arm's length is a good thing. But it depends very much on the prices eventually being right, that Enron would collapse in price and he would make a ton of money. But if every stock that he sold short collapsed in price, there would be an incentive to distort the economy. Similarly here, if people were willing to buy any garbage that you sold, think about the broker there who's going talking to a client. You know you're not going to see this client ever again. You know out there people are waiting to buy any mortgage that you can put out because they're packaging it and selling it to German banks that don't ask any questions. So when you have that kind of structure, immediately you lose all sense of anchoring because the prices are telling you do more of it, do more of it. And they did more of it countrywide, first century. The rogues gallery there is pretty strong. But they did, you don't have to portray these guys as evil, dastardly rascals. I mean, they're like us. They're probably here. It's the incentive structure which, when distorted, when prices get distorted, the modern sophisticated financial system can go a long way. So, bottom line, I started by saying, can we blame the bankers? Can we blame the regulators? Yeah, they do deserve blame, but in many ways, you can well imagine there is some truth to Lloyd Blankfein's statement that they thought they were doing God's work. The prices were telling them they were doing God's work. We need to go back and ask, why were the prices distorted? Why did the things go haywire? And I think for that, we've got to step back and ask a fundamental question about our society. Are we too unequal? Should we improve access in this society? How can we improve access? Can we do the right things instead of doing the palliatives and the wrong things which take us off course? Similarly, do we need a stronger safety net? Yeah, we have to trade off because the U.S. has always had a flexible economy which has been a source of innovation. If we increase safety nets to the level that they are in Europe, maybe we lose some of the innovation. How do we make this trade-off? What are the right metrics we should think about in doing this? Those, to my mind, are the serious questions we have to have, in addition to, of course, how much do we regulate? How do we restructure the financial system? The problem is not the government. The problem is not the financial sector. The problem is the interface between the two, which is driven by some of these larger considerations that I talked about, the fault line, so to speak, which create a perverse interface and create the kinds of problems that led to the most sophisticated financial system in the world behaving exactly like an emerging market. To get away from this, we need to fix those underlying problems, and that, to my mind, is a much bigger agenda than what anybody's talking about. So let me stop there.
Could you sculpt a political, viable solution to the problems that you have adequately? You've spent all of this time telling us how bad and how it's created, and it's reality. Can you solve it? Politically.
I think Barack Obama had a wonderful speech early on in his presidency where he said, here are the things we need to do. And he laid out a bunch of things: financial sector reform, the entitlement reform, education reform, and creating a greener economy which would provide sort of a scope for massive new growth. I think all those are sensible, but the devil is in the details. How do you do it in an effective way? And I'd say in terms of objectives, this is great. In terms of actions, I'm not persuaded that the current administration has done what it needs to do. So on the financial sector side, the key to my mind is eliminating this too big to fail, too systematic to fail, whatever you want to call it. And the answer is not silly ideas like let's have a lot of small banks. I mean, we had exactly the opposite idea after the Depression. Let's have a lot of big banks because they won't fail. Now we want a lot of small banks because they can be failed. Well, if they fail all in a row, we will come back to the rescue. So the point is not big, small. It's really trying to get banks to take less, to have the right incentives to take risk, which ultimately, as I said, means that you've got to get the market to penalize the banks when in fact it sees them taking risk. There are interesting solutions there. For example, create a class of securities which will be held by non-banks, which will be forced to bear a cost if there is a downside, which will be wiped out in any rescue. Make more of those classes of securities so that you have buffers, right? One example which we've been advocating is convertible debt that converts to equity if a bank gets into trouble and takes the hit and wipes out the existing equity. So the claim holders all have an incentive without using the bank and society as collateral, so that you're scared to fail the bank because you figure that there may be losses to society. There are things like that we should be thinking of. For example, on energy also. My sense is subsidizing this industry and that industry doesn't make a lot of sense. A carbon tax is something that every economist would suggest is the best way forward because it gives the right incentives to create the innovation which will reduce the greenhouse gases. But of course, that has been off the books for a long time. Let's think about bringing that back. So, ultimately, there are solutions. The issue is, can we summon up political will? And I think it was Churchill who said, the U.S. tries everything before it does the right thing. So my sense was to that effect. My sense is we will get there. I have hope and faith that we will get there, but we'll do a lot of stuff before we do.
Thank you really so much for such a wonderful discussion and for your optimism.
We hope this program has been informative and has provided some perspective on the underlying ethical issues.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs. For more information, see www.aooan.org.